I was standing beside Julian Ashworth, the Linden Duke, in a pawnbroker's shop that smelled of tallow and old velvet, when the little man behind the counter said the thing that undid 6 years of my friend's careful, practiced grief in a single sentence. He was hunting for a fob chain to replace one he'd lost at cards, a small matter, a nothing errand, and the pawnbroker, wanting to be agreeable, said, "Funny thing, Your Grace, you're the second person in a fortnight asking after Ashmere trinkets. There's a woman comes in here regular, laundress by her hands, buying up whatever bears your crest. Been at it years, she has. Always pays honest coin, never haggles." Julian went very still. I have known him since we were boys sharing a tutor's cane at Ashmere, and I know the particular stillness that comes over him when something has struck a nerve he keeps carefully bandaged. He did not move for the length of 3 breaths. "A laundress," he said slowly, as if tasting a foreign word, "buying Ashmere trinkets." "Aye, Your Grace. A silver toothpick case, a fan with your mother's initials, if I don't mistake the amethyst clasp. Paid dear for that one, didn't blink." I watched my friend's jaw work, watched something crack open behind those controlled eyes that I had not seen since his father's funeral, when Julian had stood dry-eyed and correct through the whole service, and then wept alone in the stable an hour later, thinking no one saw. I had seen. I have always seen more of Julian Ashworth than he would like, which is, I suppose, the whole use of a friend. "Her name," Julian said. It was not a question. It was the voice he used on tenants who owed rent and stewards who'd been careless with the accounts. The voice of a man who intended to have his answer before he left the room. The pawnbroker, to his credit, did not cower, though he did swallow hard enough that I saw his throat move above his stained cravat. "Miss Nell Hartley, Your Grace, takes in washing over on Cobb Lane. Good woman. Never asked me for a farthing back on anything, not even when I told her the fan was worth more than she offered." "Cobb Lane," Julian repeated, and then he set down the fob chain he'd been examining, forgotten, and walked out of that shop into the gray afternoon without so much as a word to the proprietor, who looked to me with the mild alarm of a man wondering if he'd said something actionable. "He'll send payment for your trouble," I told the pawnbroker, which was true, because Julian never forgot a debt, even one incurred by simple honesty. Then I went after my friend, because I have spent the better part of 20 years going after Julian Ashworth when the world knocks him sideways, and I did not imagine this day would be any different. I ought to explain, before I go further, exactly what had been knocked. Julian's father, the old Duke, had been a magnificent man gone soft and desperate in his last years. I had watched it happen the way one watches a fine old oak lean further each season until the lean becomes a fall. The cards took him slowly, then all at once. By the time he died, the family plate had been sold twice over in Julian's imagination, though in truth much of it had simply vanished into the hands of dealers and brokers all over the county, sold piecemeal by a steward too frightened to refuse his master, and too ashamed to tell the son. Along with the silver went half the household. Cooks, footmen, a laundress and her husband who had been with the family a dozen years and more, people Julian had grown up trusting the way a boy trusts the walls of his own house. Julian had spent the 6 years since his father's death rebuilding what could be rebuilt, and quietly, privately mourning what could not, the small things mostly. Not the acres which could be farmed back to health, not the roof which could be re-leaded, but his mother's locket, gone before Julian was even told it was missing. A set of miniature portraits of his grandparents, painted by a fashionable artist decades before, vanished from the long gallery wall, leaving only a paler patch of wallpaper behind. A silver christening cup that had held water for 3 generations of Ashworth heirs, himself included, sold for what I imagine was a shameful pittance to settle a debt of honor that had no honor in it whatsoever. He never spoke of these things directly. That was not his way. But I had seen him stand in that gallery more than once, looking at the pale patch on the wallpaper the way another man might look at a grave. And now a laundress on Cobb Lane buying them back. We rode there within the hour, Julian silent the whole way, his hands tight on the reins though the horse required no correction. Cobb Lane was a narrow street of respectable poverty, washing lines strung between the buildings like rigging on becalmed ships, the smell of lye soap and coal smoke thick in the air. We found the right door by asking a boy playing at marbles in the gutter, and Julian knocked with more restraint than I expected of him, given the state I could see him in. The woman who opened the door was younger than I had pictured, perhaps 24. with sleeves rolled to the elbow and forearms reddened from hot water and dark hair, escaping its pins in the way of a woman who has been working since before dawn and has long since stopped minding how she looks while she does it. She had a plain, direct face, not fashionable, but arresting in its steadiness. The face of a woman who has learned to meet trouble without flinching, because trouble has called on her before and she has always still been standing afterward. She looked at Julian's fine coat, and then at his face, and something moved behind her eyes, not fear exactly, but a kind of resigned recognition, as though a bill she had long expected had finally come due. "Your Grace," she said, and dropped a small, correct curtsy, the kind a servant's daughter learns before she learns her letters. "I'd wondered when this day would come." "Miss Hartley," Julian's voice had lost its edge. I heard something almost raw beneath the courtesy. "I have just come from a pawnbroker's shop where I was told a curious thing. I wonder if you would do me the kindness of explaining it." She did not pretend not to understand him, which I liked in her immediately. She stepped back from the door instead, holding it wide. "You had best come in then, Your Grace, though I've little enough to offer you but a hard chair and honest talk." "I have had a great deal of soft talk in soft chairs," Julian said, "and precious little honesty to go with it. I believe I would prefer the reverse." That, I confess, surprised a small, unwilling smile from her, quickly suppressed. But I saw it, and I saw Julian see it too, and something passed between them in that instant that neither of them could yet have named, though I, watching from the threshold like the unnecessary third party I so often am in my friends' more important moments, thought I recognized it well enough. Her rooms were exactly what you would expect and better kept than most gentlemen's studies I have seen. A single main room with a scrubbed table, a hearth banked low against the cost of coal, lines of drying linen strung near the rafters, and against the far wall, half hidden by a worn curtain, an old trunk with brass corners gone soft with polishing. Julian's eyes went to that trunk the way a man's eyes go to water after a desert crossing. Nell Hartley saw where he looked, and I watched her square her shoulders, not with shame, I want to be clear, for there was none of shame in her bearing, but with the particular steadiness of a woman about to explain herself to someone she respects, and wanting to be understood rightly rather than merely forgiven. "You'll want to see it," she said. It was not quite a question. "If you would permit me." She crossed the room, drew back the curtain, and knelt to lift the trunk's lid, and I watched my friend, the Linden Duke, master of 11,000 acres and a seat in the Lords, go down onto his knees on a laundress's plain floor like a man at an altar. Inside, wrapped with the same careful attention she must have given to years of other people's linens, lay a small hoard that made my own throat tighten to look at it. A silver christening cup, its shine restored by patient polishing. A locket on a fine chain, its clasp mended where it had clearly once been broken. A set of 4 miniature portraits, their frames cleaned of tarnish. A fan with an amethyst clasp, folded with tissue between its blades. Smaller things too, a snuff box, a pair of shoe buckles, a christening spoon. A whole scattered inheritance gathered piece by patient piece, and laid to rest in a trunk in a laundress's rooms, waiting. "How," Julian said, and stopped and tried again. "How long have you been doing this?" "6 years, Your Grace. Since a month or 2 after your father passed, when I first heard the toothpick case had gone to Mr. Vesey's shop. I went in to buy soap flakes, if you'll credit it, and there it was in the window, and I knew the crest at once, having polished half the silver in that house as a girl at my mother's knee." "Your mother's?" "Was laundress to your household before me, Your Grace, as I expect you don't recall, being a small boy at the time and I smaller still. My father kept the wine cellars and the plate under old Mr. Dobbins, God rest him. We had a cottage on the home farm and bread on the table every day of our lives, and your grandfather stood godfather money for me at my christening, though he never knew my name to speak it. That is more than most great houses do for their people, Your Grace, and I have not forgotten it, whatever else the world forgot." Julian was quiet a long moment, turning the christening cup over in his hands as though it might dissolve if he looked away. "My father let your family go." "Your father was a man led astray by cards and by men worse than himself who saw an opportunity in his weakness," Nell said, and there was no bitterness in it, only a plain, level truthfulness that I think struck Julian harder than any accusation could have. "I do not hold a dying man's failing against a family that fed mine for 3 generations before it. My mother always said, whatever ill befell us after, we had had the good of you Ashworths for longer than most, And a debt like that doesn't wash off in one hard season, however hard. So you have been buying back my family's belongings, Julian said, with money you earn over a washtub. With money I earn honestly, your grace, which I have never begrudged spending on this. I set a little aside every week, same as anyone saving for a rainy day. Only my rainy day was whatever turned up in Mr. Feecy's window, or Mr. Coyle's, 2 streets over, or the dealer out past the tannery who deals mostly in silver. 6 years of little bits, saved and spent as they came. I never meant for you to know if I'm honest. I meant to find some quiet way of returning it all one day without ever needing thanks for it, because thanks was never what I was after. Then what were you after? Julian's voice cracked slightly on the question, and I saw him hear it crack and saw him decide, visibly, not to be ashamed of it. Nell Hartley looked at him for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was quieter than before, stripped of the careful formality she'd worn since opening the door. I was after paying a debt nobody else remembered was owed, she said. That's all, your grace, nothing grander than that. I want to tell you that Julian answered her with some fine, sweeping speech worthy of the moment, but my friend has never been a man of fine, sweeping speeches in the moments that matter most. Instead, he simply knelt there on her floor with his family's christening cup in his 2 hands and said, very low, 6 years, as though the number itself were a kind of astonishment he could not get past, and I believe, watching him, that it was. We stayed the better part of an hour in that room, Julian asking questions in the halting, careful way of a man afraid the answers might vanish if he moved too quickly, Nell answering each one honestly, sometimes with a wry, self-deprecating humor that surprised laughter out of him more than once. Laughter I had not heard from Julian Ashworth in longer than I cared to count. When at last we rose to leave, Julian asked whether he might call again to discuss the proper disposition of the recovered items, which was, I thought privately, the thinnest excuse for wanting to see a woman again that I had ever heard from a duke's lips, and I have heard several. Nell Hartley did not pretend to misunderstand him, any more than she had pretended not to understand the pawnbroker's mention of her. You may call, your grace, she said, though I've washing to finish by Thursday and no fine parlor to receive you in beyond this one. I have found, Julian said, that I have grown tired of fine parlors. I laughed at that outright, which earned me a quelling look from my friend and the faintest, quickly hidden smile from Nell Hartley, and we took our leave into a Cobb Lane evening that felt, to me at least, considerably warmer than the one we'd ridden in on. Julian did call again, 3 days later, and then again within the week, and I want to record, because I think it does credit to them both, that these were not the calls of a duke condescending to a curiosity, nor of a woman angling above her station. They were, from the first, conversations between 2 people who had each carried something heavy and private for years and found, unexpectedly, someone else who understood the weight of it. I accompanied him on the second visit, ostensibly to help catalog the recovered items for return to Ashmere, though in truth Julian wanted a witness less for the trunk's contents than for his own conduct. I think, a check against himself, a friend to tell him afterward whether he had behaved like a gentleman or a fool. He need not have worried on either count. He behaved that whole autumn, like a man slowly waking from a long sleep of grief, and finding the world unexpectedly, cautiously lovely again. You must let me compensate you, he said to her that second visit, standing awkwardly near her hearth while she poured tea into cups that did not match, an incongruity she seemed entirely unbothered by. 6 years of savings is no small sum for anyone, let alone a laundress, Nell finished for him, not unkindly. And no, your grace, I will not. I did not do this for coin, and I'll not take coin for it now, or you'll turn a debt paid into a debt owed all over again, only running the other direction, and I've had my fill of unpaid debts running every which way in my life. Then let me at least see you do not want for anything. Your trade is honest but hard, and cold water in winter is no friend to a woman's hands. My hands have served me well enough these 26 years, Nell said, holding them up, reddened, capable hands, the hands of a woman who had never once been ashamed of her own labor, and I'll thank you not to pity them, your grace. I take pride in my trade. I do good work and I'm known for it up and down this lane, and there's women twice my age still hauling water who'd tell you the same. I don't need rescuing. I did the thing I did because I chose to, not because I was pitiful, and I'd ask you to remember the difference. Julian went quiet at that, and I saw him take the correction the way a good man takes a correction he knows is just, without argument, but with a kind of humbled attention. "You are right to check me," he said finally. "I have spent 6 years being condescended to by men who thought grief made me pitiable, and I ought to know better than to offer the same insult to someone who has just handed me back half my family's history out of nothing but her own good will. Forgive me." "There's nothing to forgive, Your Grace. Only mind it going forward." "I shall try." I watched them over the rim of my own teacup, and thought, not for the first time, that I was witnessing something considerably larger than the return of a silver cup. It was on the third visit. Julian had by then taken to calling twice a week, always with some pretext of business regarding the recovered heirlooms, pretexts growing thinner each time, that I learned the fuller history of Nell Hartley's father, and understood better why she had never once considered her long labor a burden. Her father, it transpired, had died 2 years before the old Duke, of a lung fever caught nursing his own dying wife through a hard winter, and had gone to his grave, believing his daughter would want for nothing so long as she kept to honest work and modest habits. He had taught her, she said, that a family's good name was worth more than its silver, and that the Ashworths, whatever their later failings, had given her parents both a living and a dignity that many great houses never extended to their servants at all. My mother used to say old Mr. Dobbins let her sit at his own table in the servants' hall when she first came to Ashmere, frightened half out of her wits, a girl of 15 new from the country, Nell told us, mending a torn hem as she spoke, her hands never idle even in conversation. And the old Duke himself, your grandfather, Your Grace, stopped in the laundry yard once a month to ask after her by name. Not many masters do that. Most don't know a laundress exists beyond the clean linen she leaves behind. I grew up hearing those stories at my mother's knee, same as other children hear fairy tales, and I suppose some part of me always meant to answer such kindness if ever the chance came. And when the chance came, Julian said, it came in the shape of my father losing everything decent about our house at the gaming tables. It came in the shape of an opportunity to be of use, Nell corrected him gently, which is not the same thing as an accounting of blame, Your Grace, and I'd ask you not to make it one. Your father's failing was his own to carry, and he carried it to his grave, poor man, same as we all carry our failings eventually. I never once bought back so much as a spoon out of anger at him. I did it because it seemed a shame to let good, dignified things vanish into strangers' cabinets when I had it in my power, however slowly, to see them safe again. That's all it ever was to me. A small mending, done a little at a time. I saw Julian's throat work, and understood that he was fighting down something he did not yet trust himself to say aloud, and being a good enough friend to know when to look elsewhere, I busied myself with the tea things and let the silence do its own quiet work between them. It was not all easy going, I should say, for I do not wish to paint either of them as saints without struggle, which they were not, and would themselves have been the first to deny. Julian carried, beneath his gratitude, a hard knot of guilt that took some weeks to work loose, guilt that he had never known, never asked, never once in 6 years thought to wonder what had become of the servants his father's decline had scattered to the wind. He said as much to me one evening, riding back from Cobb Lane in a light autumn rain neither of us troubled to hurry out of. I told myself I could not afford to look backward, he said, that a duke in difficulty must look only forward to the land, to the debts, to what could be salvaged and grown again. And there is truth in that. But I have learned this month that I used forward-looking as an excuse not to reckon with what and who had been lost along the way. Nell Hartley remembered my family's servants by name and history 6 years running. I could not have told you, before this month, the name of a single laundress who had ever worked at Ashmere, though a dozen must have passed through in my lifetime. That is a shame I mean to sit with a while longer, not run from. You were a young man buried in debt and grief, I told him because it was true, and because I have never believed in letting my friend flagellate himself past the point of use. You cannot be blamed for every name you failed to learn while you were fighting to keep the roof over the heads of the ones still there. Perhaps not blamed, Julian said, but I can be changed by it. That much is within my power. And changed he was, steadily, that whole autumn, not merely toward Nell Hartley, though that was the most visible change, but in smaller ways throughout the estate. He began, that season, keeping a proper written register of every soul who had ever served at Ashmere, going back through what records the steward could produce, and what memories the older tenants still held. A project he confided to me was born directly of his shame at not having known Nell's family's history before she herself had recounted it to him. He raised wages for the laundry maids still in service at Ashmere, not from any calculation of appearances, but from a plain recognition, newly and uncomfortably arrived at, of how little the great house had ever paid attention to the comfort of the hands that kept it clean. Meanwhile, his visits to Cobb Lane continued, and deepened, in the particular slow way of two careful people neither of whom wished to presume too much too soon. There is a scene I remember with special clarity from late in that autumn, which I think shows better than any amount of my own telling what had grown up between them. I had come with Julian that evening because he had asked me to an unusual request, since by then he generally preferred to call alone, and I understood without being told that something particular weighed on him. We found Nell finishing the day's ironing, the little room warm with the flat iron's heat, the smell of hot linen and starch thick in the air, and she greeted us both with the easy, unguarded welcome she had come to extend to Julian these past weeks, a welcome I noticed he no longer took for granted, if indeed he ever had. "I have brought the last piece," Julian said, and drew from inside his coat a small velvet box which he set upon her scrubbed table. Feesy had it after all tucked in a back drawer he'd forgotten, my mother's wedding ring. I did not think it survived those years, and yet here it is. Nell opened the box, and I watched her face, that steady, unflinching face that had met a duke's sudden appearance on her doorstep without a flicker of fear, crumple just slightly at the sight of a plain gold band gone soft with age. "I remember this," she said quietly. "My mother spoke of it, said your mother wore it even doing rough work in the still room, never minded scratching it, said a ring was meant to be lived in, not locked away." She looked up at Julian. "You ought to keep this closest of all, your grace. This one is not a trinket. This one is a heart." "I know," Julian said, "which is why I did not buy it back myself." Nell frowned, not understanding. "I asked Feesy to hold it," Julian said, "and I came here tonight to ask you to be the one to place it in my hands, because everything else in that trunk you gathered alone, out of a loyalty that asked nothing back, and I did nothing myself to earn any part of its return. I find I cannot bear for this last piece, the dearest of them all, to come to me any other way than through your hands, Nell. I would rather owe the whole of my family's history to you plainly, and say so aloud, than pretend I recovered any part of it myself. I do not think either of them remembered in that moment that I stood not 4 feet away, and I confess I made myself very small and very quiet, and studied the rafters with great interest, while Nell Hartley took up the ring in her red, capable hands and pressed it into Julian Ashworth's palm, and did not immediately let go. "There," she said, her voice not quite steady. "Now it is properly come home, your grace, and so, I think, are you." "Julian," he said, "if you would. I find I have grown weary of my own title in this room, of all rooms." "Julian, then," she said, and I heard, in the simple willingness with which she said it, the sound of something settling between them that had been circling for weeks, looking for a place to land. There was, before that final evening, one difficulty I have not yet recorded, because it seemed to me at the time a small thing, and only in hindsight did I understand how much it had tested both of them. Word travels fast among servants and faster still among the idle gentry who depend on servants for their gossip, and by early winter it was known throughout 3 counties that the Linden Duke had taken to calling regularly upon a laundress on Cobb Lane. I will not pretend the talk was kind. I heard it myself at my club, men I had known 20 years leaning close over their brandy to ask whether it was true Ashworth meant to marry beneath him, whether grief had turned his head, whether some scheming washerwoman had contrived to entrap a lonely duke with a sad tale, and a trunk full of borrowed trinkets got up to look like an inheritance. I defended my friend as best I could in those rooms, though I confess my temper wore thin faster than my patience, and I came near to calling out a baronet's younger son who suggested, with a smirk I still remember unkindly, that Miss Hartley's 6 years of purchases were more likely a long con than a labor of love. Julian, when I told him of it afterward, for I did tell him, thinking he ought to know what was being said before he heard it second hand and worse, only asked, quietly, whether I believed it myself. "Not for one moment," I said. "Then it hardly matters what fools say over brandy," he answered, though I could see it cost him something to say it so evenly, and I understood that the cost was not for his own pride, which had weathered worse, but for what such talk might do to Nell if it ever reached her ears in its uglier forms. It did reach her, of course, as such things always do. A woman 2 doors down on Cobb Lane, jealous perhaps of the attention Nell's washing trade had gained from the association, repeated some version of the club gossip to her face outright, calling her a scheming creature who had angled after a duke's pity with a sad story and a box of stolen silver. I was not present for that exchange, but Nell told Julian of it herself the following week, plainly and without self-pity, exactly as I had come to expect of her. She said I ought to be ashamed, cozening a grieving man out of his good sense, Nell reported, folding linen as she spoke, her hands as steady as ever though her voice carried an edge I had not heard in it before. I told her every piece in that trunk was bought with a bill of sale I still hold, every one of them, 6 years of receipts kept in a tin box under my bed, because I always meant, if the day ever came, to prove exactly what I'd done and how, plainly, without anyone's charity dressing it up prettier than it was. I am not ashamed of a single week's wages I ever spent on this, and I'll not let an idle tongue make me feel otherwise. You kept the receipts, Julian said, something like wonder in his voice. Of course I kept the receipts, Nell said, almost impatient with him. Did you think I meant to hand your family's history back to you on nothing better than my own word, Julian, with no proof behind it, and let anyone who liked call me a liar or worse? I am a laundress, not a fool. I have always known how the world looks at a poor woman claiming honest dealings with rich men's property. I made certain, from the very first purchase, that I could account for every penny and every piece, whether or not the day ever came that anyone asked me to. I think it was in that moment, hearing the story second-hand from Julian that evening, that I understood most fully why he had fallen for her as he had. It was not merely her loyalty, remarkable as that was, nor her dignity under an unkind word, admirable as that was too. It was the plain, unglamorous foresight of a woman who had never once trusted the world to take her at her word, and had armed herself against its doubts long before she ever needed to, not out of bitterness, but out of the same quiet, unsentimental competence with which she ran every other part of her life. Julian did not let the matter rest quietly, either, whatever patience he had counseled to me. He called upon the neighbor woman himself, the following day, and though he would not repeat to me every word of what passed between them, I gathered it involved a very correct, very ducal explanation of exactly how tiresome a slander suit could become for a woman of modest means, delivered with such icy courtesy that the neighbor was reportedly seen curtsying to Nell in the street not 3 days later, with considerably more warmth than she had ever shown before. You did not need to fight my battles for me, Nell told him when she heard of it, though I thought she looked more moved than vexed. I did not fight it for you, Julian said. I fought it because a slander against you is a slander against the truth, and I find I have grown rather protective of the truth, this past season, having gone 6 years without much of it near me at all. It was some weeks after that evening. Winter properly arrived by then, frost thick on the windows of Cobb Lane, the whole street muffled under a hard cold that made the little room's hearth fire and lamplight feel like a small kept promise against the dark outside, that Julian asked me to accompany him on what he called, with uncharacteristic nervousness, a final settling of accounts, though I understood well enough by then that no accounts remained unsettled between them save the largest one of all. We arrived at dusk, the trunk still standing open near the hearth where it had stood for weeks now, its contents gradually removed piece by piece back to Ashmere as Julian found proper places to restore them. The miniatures back on the gallery wall, the christening cup back in its cabinet, though he had asked, and Nell had agreed that the locket remain a little longer in her keeping. Since it seems only right, he had said, that the last piece should go last and go together. Only the locket and a scattering of smaller trinkets remained now, laid out on a square of clean linen beside the trunk, catching the lamplight in small, warm glints of silver and gilt. Julian knelt beside that half-emptied trunk, much as he had the very first evening, and Nell knelt across from him, and I stood by the door with my hat in my hands, wondering whether I ought to have waited outside after all, though Julian had specifically asked me to witness this. In the plain, old-fashioned way a man wants a friend present at the turning points of his life. I have been turning something over all winter, Julian said, and I find I can turn it no longer without saying it plainly, so I hope you will forgive me for want of better phrases. Nell Hartley, I came to your door in autumn a grieving man who did not know how much he had lost, or how quietly someone had labored 6 years to give it back to him without ever asking to be thanked or known for it. I have spent every week since learning that the woman who did that labor is not only loyal beyond anything I deserve, but honest and steady, and possessed of more quiet dignity than any duchess I have ever stood beside in a ballroom. I do not offer you a title tonight, though a title will come with it, because I think you would rightly tell me a title is the least interesting thing about what I am asking. I am asking you to let me spend the rest of my life being worthy of the kind of loyalty you have already shown a family that, until you knocked its history back into my hands, had very nearly forgotten how to deserve it. I love you, Nell. I have loved you, I think, since the moment you told me you did it all for no reward, and asked for none even then, kneeling on your own floor. Will you marry me? Nell Hartley did not answer at once, and I will say for her credit that she did not weep prettily and fall into his arms as I imagine some novelist might have arranged it. She sat back on her heels and looked at him a long, searching moment, the lamplight catching the tears she did not bother to hide but did not perform either, and when she spoke her voice was steady. I need you to understand something first, Julian, before I answer, she said. I did not do what I did hoping for this. I want that said plainly between us before anything else is said. I bought back your family's silver because it was owed, not because I dreamed a duke might one day kneel on my floor and ask for my hand. If you are marrying me out of gratitude alone, dressed up in finer words, I would rather know it now and refuse you kindly, and keep the friendship we've built, than marry a debt paid twice over. I have thought on that very question more than any other these past months, Julian answered, precisely because I did not trust my own heart to separate gratitude from love at first, and I would not insult you with the one dressed as the other. But I have watched you these months mend hems, argue prices with dealers on my family's behalf without once softening your own opinions to please me, correct me when I condescended to you, and laugh at my poor jokes only when they deserved laughing at and not a moment before. I do not love you because you saved my family's silver, Nell. I love you because of the woman who chose, unprompted and unrewarded, to spend 6 years of her own hard-earned money on a debt no one else alive remembered was owed, and who then sat across from a duke and told him plainly she wanted no pity and no rescue, only respect. That is not gratitude speaking. That is a man who has finally met a woman equal to every good thing he ever believed his family once stood for. I confess my own eyes were not entirely dry by the end of that speech, though I will deny it if asked in company, and Nell Hartley, laundress of Cobb Lane, looked at the Linden Duke of Ashmere across a half-emptied trunk of recovered silver and said at last, "Then yes, Julian. Yes, I will marry you, and gladly, though I mean to keep taking in washing a while, yet if it suits me, title or no title, because I built a trade I'm proud of with my own 2 hands, and I'll not set it down merely because a ring's gone on my finger." I would think less of you if you did, Julian said, and meant it, and reached across the trunk to take her reddened, capable hand in his, not to still it, but simply to hold it, the way a man holds the hand of someone he intends to walk beside rather than ahead of for the whole remaining length of his life. I ought to say a word here about Mr. Vesey the pawnbroker, since he played a larger part in this tale than his brief appearance at the start of it might suggest, and Julian himself would want him remembered properly, for he was not a man to let a kindness go unmarked, even a small one rendered by a stranger in the ordinary course of trade. Julian called upon Vesey's shop again, some weeks after that first fateful visit, not to buy anything this time, but simply to thank the man properly and to settle, as he had promised, whatever debt of information he felt he owed. Vesey received him with the particular nervousness of a tradesman unused to a duke, darkening his door twice in one season, and stood wringing his hands behind the counter, as though bracing for some complaint about his conduct. "Your Grace, if I spoke out of turn that day." "You spoke exactly enough," Julian told him, "and I have come to thank you for it, not to scold you. I understand you have known Miss Hartley some years now in the way of business." "6 years and more, Your Grace, same as she'll have told you herself. Never known a customer like her. Most that come in buying back family things do it in a temper, wanting what's theirs returned at any price, cursing the fellow who pawned it in the first place. Miss Hartley never once cursed anybody. Just asked after the price, calm as Sunday, and paid it if she could manage, and if she couldn't, she'd ask me kindly to hold the peace a month or 2 till she'd saved the rest. And I always did, because a woman who pays her debts as faithfully as that is worth the waiting." "Did she ever explain why?" Julian asked, though I think he asked more to hear another voice confirm what he already believed than from any real doubt. "Not at first, Your Grace. Took near 2 years before she told me any of it, and only then because I asked outright, curious as any man would be. Said her family had been treated kindly once by better people than most, and she meant to answer it in her own time, in her own way, without making a show of it. I told her more than one gentleman would pay handsome to have his name attached to such a tale, make himself out a saint for the telling of it, and she laughed at me, laughed, Your Grace, right there at my counter, and said she wasn't doing it to be written about in anybody's papers. She was doing it because it needed doing, and she was the one who could do it. I've traded silver and gold 30 years in this shop, Your Grace, and I'll tell you plainly, I never met her equal for quiet conviction. Whatever comes of this business, you might do worse than to trust a woman who never once asked me to keep her secret for her own credit, only because she preferred it that way. Julian left the shop that day and bought, before we returned to Ashmere, a small chain and clasp of good but unshowy silver, which he had fee polish himself rather than send to a fashionable jeweler in town. Since it seems only right, he told me, echoing without seeming to notice it the very phrase Nell herself favored, that a chain meant to hold my mother's mended locket should pass through the same honest hands that kept faith with it these 6 years. Rather than some stranger's shop that never knew the weight of what it carried, Fisi, for his part, would accept no payment beyond the cost of the silver itself, and when Julian pressed him, the old pawnbroker only shook his head and said that some accounts were better left as they stood, a sentiment I noted Julian took to heart more broadly than perhaps even Fisi intended, for it was not long after that he began quietly forgiving small debts owed to the estate by tenants who had fallen on hard seasons, a kindness he had not extended so freely before that autumn, and one he never spoke of as connected to anything Fisi had said, though I believed it was, and believe it still. They were married the following spring, in the small chapel at Ashmere rather than some grander cathedral in town, at Nell's particular request, since it seems only fitting, she said, to be married in the same house my mother once scrubbed floors in, only this time as its lady rather than its laundress, though she made a point, ever afterward, of visiting the laundry yard each week to speak with the women who worked there, by name. Remembering each one's history, the way her own mother's history had once been remembered by an old duke long dead, and the way it had nearly, but for a pawnbroker's idle remark, been forgotten by his grandson. I stood beside Julian at that wedding as I had stood beside him at his father's funeral, and I thought, watching Nell Hartley walk toward him in a plain, well-made gown of her own choosing rather than the elaborate silks the dressmakers had pressed upon her, that I had never in my life seen my friend look less like a grieving man, and more like one who had, after 6 long years of looking backward at what was lost, finally been given good cause to look only forward. The gallery at Ashmere hangs today much as it always did, the miniatures restored to their proper places, the pale patches of old wallpaper finally repainted over, the christening cup gleaming once more in its cabinet, ready, Julian tells me with a private smile I have learned to recognize, for whatever small Ashworth may one day need it. And in a modest room on Cobb Lane, though the Duchess herself now keeps a fine house at Ashmere, there stands still an old trunk with brass corners gone soft with polishing, empty now of silver, but kept, Nell says, as a reminder that the truest inheritances are not always the ones written into a will, but the ones a person chooses, quietly and without hope of thanks, to hand back to the world regardless. I have told this story many times since, at dinners and in letters to friends who ask how the Linden Duke came to marry a laundress, and I have watched more than one skeptical listener soften by the end of it, the way frost softens under a patient fire. It is not, I think, a story about a poor woman raised up by a rich man's favor, whatever the gossips in town would prefer to make of it. It is a story about a debt that outlived the man who incurred it, and a woman who chose, alone and unthanked for 6 quiet years, to see it paid regardless, and about a duke humble enough, when the truth finally reached him by pure chance in a pawnbroker's shop, to kneel down on a laundress's floor and recognize, at last, a devotion worth spending the rest of his life trying to deserve. That, to my mind, is the whole of it, and I do not think either of them would thank me for adding a single word more.